You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the KTPF Reload Show. In case you're wondering what the Reload Show is about, if you haven't heard previous shows, these are the interviews that were conducted by good friends of mine, Steve and Sue Taggart, in the days of the KTPF radio show. Their own radio show ran for just over 4 years, broadcasting every week for over 3 hours. I joined them in the last 18 months of the show's run, but eventually the guys felt they'd just about had enough. It was a monumental effort to keep broadcasting every week for 3 hours. It was a wonderful show. But unfortunately they're no longer involved, and the shows have just sort of sat in the archives, so I thought it would be nice to bring them back to life and bring you the interviews that the guys conducted over those 4 years. They include some of the most interesting people within the world of the paranormal and some not so well known, but still, nevertheless still very interesting. We even have 1 or 2 rather unusual shows, including a live seance and other things along those lines. Anyway, hopefully you'll enjoy tonight's show, and this is the KTPF Reload Show. Enjoy.
You're in the right place. Online, on the web, and on air. All over the world. Talk radio. You hear us, we hear you.
Yeah, good evening everybody, and welcome to the KTPF Community Talk Show. How are you? Welcome to tonight's show, the 8th of December. We've got a young man coming on from Kent, Rochester to be precise. His name's Neil Arnold. We'll be giving him a ring at 9 o'clock to talk to him. He's the author of many books, including Monsters, the A to Z of Zoo Form Phenomena, and other books including Haunted Chatham, Haunted Rochester, and others related to Kent's most supernatural places. He's had a passion for the stranger folklore since the age of 9. His main influence was an American movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek, about a hairy man-beast said to roam the river bottoms of Arkansas. I don't know if any of you have seen that or not. As a teenager, he became interested in Bigfoot, the Yeti, and other obscure monsters across the world. As I said, he is a folklore researcher, so we'll be talking to him about his study of these monsters, including winged humanoids, the paranormal, hellhounds that he says he's been hunting and stuff like that, as well as the vampire of Highgate Cemetery.
Yeah, and also your
my favourite,
your old stomping ground.
Yes,
down at Bluebell Hill.
The ghost of Bluebell Hill.
And he said Mothman is fascinated by it.
Yes, he's also fascinated by the Mothman. But just to let you know that there is a story that I recall from my childhood from Kent. I'm going to ask him about that. I wonder if he knows about it, whether it's in the book.
Is it one of the urban legends, or is it true?
This is it. I'm assuming it's an urban legend. Either that, or it really was a crazed man from the local loony bin that got away. I don't know.
I think that bit was an urban legend.
But we'll find out later on, hopefully. Neil Arnold, you hail from Rochester, and also you're a folklorist, and you're into cryptozoology. Now, the thing is, how did you get into all this?
Basically, when I was a kid, and I was kind of sick to death of reading the same old information in so many books that were being written by researchers, especially sort of allegedly well-respected authors on ghosts and stuff like that. So I began just researching it, more so regarding the side of monsters and folklore.
Yeah.
But I've always had a bit of an interest in that kind of stuff. But it was mainly stemmed from stories from my dad and my granddad, and then watching a film called The Legend of Boggy Creek when I was about 8 or 9.
Okay, so it's set in your mind then, did it?
Yeah, well, Legend of Boggy Creek terrified me when I was a kid, and it's like a pseudo-documentary style, not really a horror film, about a Bigfoot type creature said to roam like the murky swamps of Arkansas in the United States, and I was just so intrigued by that possibility that there could be monsters around and stuff like that. So I just began really looking into it and trying to sort of peel back the layers of any sort of, if there was any meaning behind these stories, or they were just sort of, campfire tales.
Right. Okay. Now you've written many books about this sort of thing. One of the books that comes to mind is the A to Z of zooform phenomena. Now, first of all, for those that aren't used to this new word zooform, can you please tell us? John Downes, I take it, is responsible for this word.
Yeah, the book is called Monster.
Yeah.
A to Z of zooform phenomena. It's kind of zooform phenomena is a bit of a complicated term, but it seemed that in the paranormal world, a lot of so-called sort of ghost hunters and people like that weren't really researching anything to do with strange creatures that seem to be supernatural. From sort of phantom dogs and cats, sort of more demonic manifestations. And I think John Downes, who runs the Centre for Fortean Zoology down in Devon, he gave it this term to sort of describe creatures that simply can't be. So we're talking about stuff like the Jersey Devil, Mothman, the Goat Man, all over the world, Phantom Black Dog, which aren't just sort of, ghosts of somebody's pet that's died. There's obviously something more to this than meets the eye. So that's why I kind of did the book. It started off as a really small article, and then it ended up sort of like 400-page book and A to Z. As far as I'm aware, no one's ever sort of done a similar book, because it's not really cryptozoological. It's covering more sort of demonic manifestations.
Now, you have a feeling about this, don't you, when it comes to this sort of thing, that about the entities, I believe. Yeah, and you are into the paranormal as well, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I've written a lot. I'm not a huge believer, but I think there's too much stuff being written that's all the same, and especially since the 1970s. There was a lot of authors around that were the only really sort of authors of their time, and they was often considered well respected, and yet, I've been doing a lot of research, particularly in sort of the southeast of England, although I write about stuff all over the world. You start to realise some of these original books that are so revered are actually incorrect. So I wanted to kind of go into a lot more detail with local folklore and try and strip back to find out if there's anything behind some of these sort of legends. And sometimes there is still a small percentage that can't be explained, but there's obviously a lot of stuff that can be.
Yeah. Now, your interests are quite eclectic, really, with the cryptozoology and everything else. But what would you say was your main field of interest?
If anything, it's probably the more sort of demonic side. The fact I get a lot of, I keep a lot of different stuff that I do sort of separately from one another, because I do a lot of the research into sort of the so-called big cat sightings across Britain. But also with cryptozoology, that's very different. Cryptozoology is more to do with like searching for hidden animals that could well exist. So, they're scientifically possible, but there's certain things which just can't be possible. When somebody sees a hairy winged humanoid with burning red eyes, it's just not biologically possible. So there's got to be something in that, and I think these are more connected to the human psyche rather than actual sort of other dimensions.
Right, and when it comes to the cats in Kent, it seems to be a bit of a hotspot, would you say? Are there a lot of prey in Kent, as we have been told, where there is deer, there is big cats? Yeah,
to an extent, the big cat stuff is such a complex subject. Again, I was interested when I was about 8 and started looking around thinking there's hardly anybody. At the time when I was sort of 8, there was a lady called Di Francis and a couple of other researchers who were collecting evidence and sightings, but nobody was really looking into this all the time.
No.
And I eventually sort of made it my job, because I was sick to death of people saying that these big cats were ghosts and stuff like that, and that's where it gets a fine line with folklore, because stuff starts to melt into folklore when people don't really research it properly, so they don't find the evidence. But, I cover, again, stuff all over the world, but mainly in the southeast of England. There's clearly populations of these large cats, and people just don't realise the amount of evidence is out there. And of course, there is enough food, and like you say, there's a lot of deer around, so deer would sort of prove to be a perfect sort of.
Yeah, but we was at the Weird Weekend last year, and we met John McGowan.
Yep.
And but where we were staying, the second night we slept, we actually heard what we thought we heard was a howling sort of thing, and these dogs that were in this van were really going crazy. And it wasn't until the next day that John said he actually heard a cat, and he thought it was somebody messing about.
Right.
But when we told him we'd heard the same thing, and we told him how we heard it, he was more happy to find out that he wasn't being taking the mick out of, you know.
Yeah, I believe that John said that what everybody's heard was from a leopard.
Yes, that's correct.
Which is quite a distinctive sound. Of course, they give different noises.
Yeah.
Mating call of a leopard is quite unusual as well, and often it's important to see how other things react, especially other dogs.
Yeah, I was very pleased that I actually heard something like that, to be honest with you, and I learned about the scat and everything else.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, a lot of people don't realise the amount of evidence is out there. The trouble is, you know, when you're in sort of my line of work, you do get a lot of detractors and people that, you know, seem to sort of like, you know, slag you off and stuff.
Oh,
like
yeah.
that. People just don't think there's this type of evidence. With the paranormal, it's a lot more difficult to find actual evidence. But with something like a cat, people are saying, oh, well, it's paranormal, it's a demon. I'm thinking, but it's actually left scat. I've had people telling me, well, a demon can leave scat, and I really don't know of any demons that go around sort of pooping everywhere.
Yeah.
So I find that a bit kind of, it's clear there's large cats around, and there's every reason for there to be these animals as well. So.
Right. Now, talking about these animals, what would you consider would be monsters in this country?
Well, of course, the big classic one is the Loch Ness Monster. I don't think there's anything in Loch Ness that can be deemed a monster.
No.
I do believe that in regard to the paranormal or anything like that, the eyewitness reports are very unreliable. So you always have to look for evidence. The trouble with Loch Ness is it's mystical. I went there in '96, and I was amazed at the amount of tourists that were taking photographs of shadows, wakes, splashes in the water, clearly not accustomed to sort of, you know, natural or normal phenomena. I think that what's in Loch Ness has altered over the years, but it seems mostly to be something like a large sturgeon that visits every now and then.
Yeah.
Or possibly something like a large catfish, which would, of course, be around sort of the bottom of the loch. But I think it's 26 miles long, 800 foot deep, so it's a perfect place for a monster, but it can't biologically be a long-necked plesiosaur in Loch Ness. It just does not make sense at all, because it would be a huge animal. There's got to be more than one. They've got to have had a breeding population for many, many years, and there's got to be enough food. But if something is visiting every now and then, like a sturgeon, that would explain most of the sightings of a humpback in the water, which is like an upturned boat. And sturgeon can grow up to about 20 feet.
Yeah. When it comes to the things like the Loch Ness Monster, why do you think people hoax a lot?
I think some hoaxers just do it for a bit of fun. There's not always that amount of malice, but I think with things like the Loch Ness Monster, we need these things. Once they're in, if these creatures or these stories are good enough, whether it's a haunting, a monster story, if they're good enough, they get passed down over the years, and they embed themselves into local culture and folklore. So it's not about whether they're real in the end. We just love the mystery of it. Everything becomes a Loch Ness Monster. And let's face it, you can't call it sort of the Loch Ness catfish, because it doesn't sound very good. So you've kind of got to have stories that, for dark and stormy nights, that are, you know, better suited for our kind of folklore.
Do you think it could be possible? We've heard this before. Ghost Riders asking in the chat room. We've heard it many times before. The possibility that Loch Ness could be a ghost, an apparition.
I would say that is complete rubbish. I think again that it's a case of too many people again want somewhere like Loch Ness to be eerie, because they talk about, you know, Boleskine House where Aleister Crowley used to live, that he may have raised this demonic thing. The first ever report, allegedly going back to sort of like 565 AD with St. Columba, could be anything like a large catfish, what he described as casting this creature back into the lake. But I don't think there's any reason for it to be paranormal, mainly due to the fact that people more consistently see an upturned boat. They don't really describe the long neck anymore. So I do find it's more interesting in the cultural aspect, how these things change over the time, a little bit like aliens and things like that. Our perceptions of them change. Does that mean they exist, or that they exist within us? and that we unintentionally change them and form them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, we've heard about the stories at Cannock Chase, and the amount of phenomena that's supposed to be there, not just the ghosts of the cemetery, but we've heard about big worms and werewolves. Do you think there could be the possibility that there are wolves in this country?
No, I don't believe there's any wolves, and I don't believe there's any werewolves. I think it's not about being sceptical. You've got to look, like anything, you've got to look at evidence.
Yeah.
When people talk about things like Bigfoot in the United States, when you look at mountain lions, they're very, very elusive, and yet we still find scat. We still find the occasional body.
Yeah.
So with something like Bigfoot, you'd expect to find something. With wolves in the UK, unless you have the occasional escapee, they're nearly always shot dead or recaptured. Werewolves, there's been sort of one or two reports, but it's still down to eyewitness perception. Cannock Chase is one of those places that attracts not phenomena, but people call it a window area.
Yeah.
And anything that sort of happens, they always try to blame it on one of those things they've heard about. There's been several books written about sort of Cannock Chase, and I think they've all been quite disappointing, very scant. And that pretty much sums up the area. It's fleeting all the time. People talk about big cats there and that they've never seen any evidence, but there is evidence for large cats there. But for somebody to say they've seen a werewolf, to me, I'd have to question possibly the witness, or is it down to something that's within them? That they, people do see very strange things. It doesn't mean it's flesh and blood. But
do you
it can't
think
be sort of, a real werewolf?
Yeah. Do you think a lot of the time we see what we want to see when we go looking for these animals?
Well, I've taken lots of people out into the woods over the years, and it's amazing what the imagination can do.
Yeah.
And also, as well, when you've got a story that's embedded in local culture, how it is passed down over the years. There's a place I live live in Kent called Bluebell Hill, and it's got a similar kind of atmosphere to Cannock Chase. I do actual sort of monster and ghost walks around the area, and people go there because they've heard about this story of a woman in white on the hill that hitches a lift, gets into the back of a car, and then vanishes. And I've looked into this, and there are no actual reports of this woman being picked up. And also, they tie it to a crash that took place in the 60s. Now, there was a crash that took place involving a bride-to-be, and she did die. But what people don't realise is the power lies in the fact that the newspapers have tied this together.
Yeah.
Not realising that the reports on the hill go back to the early 1900s. So it's a friend of a friend type of story, an urban folk tale that's passed on. But of course, if they're good enough, then they last forevermore.
I remember years ago when I used to live in Chatham, I remember seeing in the local paper that reading the story that this man had driven through Bluebell Hill, and he felt as though he'd run something over, and when he looked, she was lying in the road. This is the story it said in the paper. He put her in the car. This was how the story went. He put her in the car, in the back seat, put a blanket over her, went to Medway Hospital, run in to get one of the doctors, nurses, whatever. When they came running out, he opened the car door. It still looked as though she was there. They pulled the cover off of her, and she'd gone. And he had to be dealt with, but the paper said he had to be dealt with shock.
Yeah, the trouble is, right, the paper's got that wrong. What really happened is that a guy did actually hit a young girl on the hill in 1974.
Right.
He got out the car. Of course, there was no mobile phones back then. The little girl, who was about 12, which is bizarre considering the girls that died in the crash were sort of early 20s, late things. She was laying in the road. He laid a blanket over the top of her.
Yeah.
He didn't want to pick her up in case she had internal bleeding, broken bones. He left her by the side of the road, drove to the police station, came back with a police officer, and all that was laying there was the blanket. The police at the time took it so serious, they actually did employ the help of a tracker dog, but he couldn't pick up any scent. So the story of it actually going to the hospital is a classic part of hitchhiker folklore of how there's something left in the back seat to tie it together with the ghost story.
Funny enough, it was round about that time I read it in the paper.
That was the first one, yep. It did mostly begin from 71. It got very weird in 92 when people started knocking a girl down. Most people on the hill do actually, in fact, see a woman by the side of the road in old-fashioned sort of pale clothing. And we do believe we've actually found out who that girl is, and that is mentioned in a couple of my books. But the general story is the press completely getting it wrong, as usual.
Now, you, as you say, you've done this book on urban legends, and
lots of Chinese whispers too.
Yeah, and I would like to know about an urban legend, or I assume an urban legend that I've heard about, whether you've heard it at all. I remember being at school, and just to set the scene, it was the end of a drama lesson, and our teacher decided, for some unknown reason, she was going to tell us a ghost story, about what had happened to her friend. Yeah. And funny enough, it's near Bluebell Hill, the road that I'm thinking of. It's just at the top of it, top end of Bluebell Hill, the Chatham side sort of thing. And there's a dead end road that goes off. Back in the day, just at the top of it, there used to be a garage. I don't know if it's still there, because it's definitely changed since when I was a child. I go back regularly, and it's, oh my God, I can't believe how much it's changed. Yeah. But there was a road, and apparently her friend, this is what she said, and her boyfriend, partner, whatever, run out of petrol, so they pulled down this little side road. And what had happened was, he said, it was late at night, stay in the car, can you please stay in the car? I'm going to go up to that garage and get a can of petrol and come back, and we'll go home, yeah, or whatever. And so she stayed in the car, and he went off. And next minute, she heard banging on the top of the car, right? And she ignored it and everything, but it got louder and louder. Now, next minute, there was a tap on the side of the window, and it was the policeman. And she rolled the window down, and he said, can you please step out the car?
Don't look back.
Don't look back. And apparently there was what we assume, a escape madman or something, right? And he'd got her boyfriend, got the head, and he was banging it on top of the car.
I think this one came from America, to be honest.
I don't know, but that's what she told me.
I don't want to disappoint you guys, but that is, again, it's complete urban legend.
That's just what I was thinking. I was told this when I was, in early senior school, so it's something that has always lived with me, and I'm maybe, as I say...
Yeah, the great thing is about it is that it's actually, that stems from an American story going back to the 1950s, because you've also got the story of the hook of a killer going around leaving sort of spooking lovers' lanes. It's often, again, connected to an automobile car, often involves a lone sort of lady left in the car. There's varying versions. One is that she hears scratching on the roof, and what happens is the police turn up, and the policeman gets out about sort of 100 yards away and has got a megaphone. He tells her to get out of the car but not look back, and she looks back, and her boyfriend's hanging from a tree, and it's his feet that are sort of scratching on the top of the roof.
Oh my God.
The power, again, is the fact that it's such a good story, but it's always a friend of a friend. So because when you're younger, you don't really... The power lies in the fact that you're not interested in the details, because you didn't turn around when you was a kid and say, what was the name of the person it happened to?
No.
Because the power lies in the fact it's almost the bogeyman at the end.
I think I was about 12 years old, so it was a good story.
That's a popular story. I've actually mentioned that in the Kent Urban Legends book, because it's actually popular all over the UK, that story.
Really?
And over the United States, and that's where it stems from.
Oh, right.
It's actually, most of these are 1950s. There's a great story about when you was at school, and they used to say, if you go home at night, go up in the bathroom, turn the light out, light a candle, stare in the mirror, and if you say the Lord's Prayer backwards 13 times, or whatever, it depends, then this woman called Bloody Mary will appear in the mirror, this old hag. So people used to freak out, didn't really want to do it. Other people sort of call her Scary Mary, and they still say, now if you say her name, Scary Mary, we killed your baby, or something like that. It's almost got a ritualistic type of look. So I think, again, with the car, it's always the automobile and leaving sort of the trace of something on the roof, something in the back seat, and that's why it's so powerful.
So you've done this book on Kent Urban Legends. Was there any that have actually stand up to scrutiny?
Apart from, the Bluebell Hill one is odd because it fits in with the classic archetype. She leaves a coat behind in the back of the car, and the motorist, although it's late, drives to the place where she wanted to be dropped off, and he's told by the parents that was their daughter, but she died sort of 30 years ago. But what's interesting with Bluebell Hill is that people do actually knock a girl down.
Yeah. It
happens roughly every year on Bluebell Hill, and a few months throughout the year. So that one sort of does come to life. But most of the stories are simply spook stories. There's a village in Kent called Pluckley, and it's said to be the most haunted village in Britain, which is complete rubbish because most of the ghost stories were made up in the 1950s.
Really?
And ghost hunters still go there every Halloween expecting to see the 12 classic ghosts of the ghostly monk, the highwayman, the phantom coach and horses. And there is said to be a bush down there called the Devil's Bush. And they say that if you go up to it on certain nights and take off all your clothes and dance around it backwards 13 times, then the devil is sure to appear. Personally, I don't know anybody stupid enough to do that. But, of course, the legend lasts forevermore because nobody's brave enough and no one knows where the bush is anyway.
No, it's definitely not. So
that's how the story, why they last, because they've almost got a vagueness to them.
yeah, well, I must admit, I do have a love for Kent and its legends, you know, so I can see me getting that in my Christmas stocking, I think.
Well, it's a nice little short book as well. It's quite funny. It's probably the best one I've done in the sense it's written from sort of personal experiences and stories that I've heard growing up at school and stuff like that. So there's a lot of local sort of towns like Chatham and Rochester and Pluckley mentioned in there, and a lot of these sort of car legends as well. That one's mentioned in there. The story you said about the guy who goes off with the petrol, that's actually mentioned in there as well.
Oh, that's good. So, now I've noticed through some of your books you have actually done quite a few haunted series, haven't you? You've done Tunbridge Wells and Rochester.
Yeah.
And also, as you say, Chatham. Now, I believe somewhere in Chatham, Charles Dickens is supposed to haunt somewhere, or is it actually in Rochester? One of the two.
Well, again, like everything, it depends on who you talk to and the stories. The trouble is with Dickens, although what I love about Dickens is that he actually wrote ghost stories, obviously Christmas Carol and The Signalman. But he sort of grew up in Chatham and then he used to spend a lot of his time in Rochester, and they always say that before he died, he wanted to be buried in the castle moat. But, of course, he was eventually interred at Westminster Abbey, and ever since then they reckon he kind of haunts parts of Rochester. He stands under the big moon-faced clock of the Corn Exchange in the High Street. But, again, nobody's ever seen him.
No.
But when you consider how old Kent is in general, any time a weird shadowy figure is seen, the same as Pluckley, they always blame one of the 12 ghosts, or they always blame Charles Dickens. So that's how the stories last. But I wanted to write a book about Rochester because it is so old, and nobody's ever written a book about Rochester ghost stories. So I managed to find a bit of a niche with some of these books. Yeah.
Now, I believe in Rochester, the last witch was burnt. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's true. I know that it was one of the last hangings that took place.
Right, okay.
The guy that had committed a murder, he was a bit like a local buster. In a drunken rage, he killed this young boy, which is mentioned in the book. I imagine that one of the last witches, they would have possibly been interred around the castle moat, because that never had any water in it. And there were plague victims and witches that were persecuted down on Penardon Heath, which is just a couple of miles away in Maidstone. So we do know that there's possibly sort of remains in those kind of areas.
And there's always been a legend around the Rochester Castle Keep as well with the White Lady, wasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. Again, but it's classic folklore. You know, ladies in white are those archetypes.
They're everywhere.
Like black dogs, and that's what we seem to forget with folklore. We very rarely, investigators very rarely stop and take a look back at the history and think, hold on a minute, maybe people are actually kind of bringing these things to life rather than these things actually being there. I'm of the opinion, if you believe in something enough, it actually starts to happen.
There is always a lady in white or a lady in grey. I've never really heard of a lady in black.
Women in black are quite common. There is a hideous story from Bluebell Hill of a woman in black.
Really?
Quite petrifying. If any of you guys have seen the awful Woman in Black film, starring Harry Potter, you'll probably know, or may not know, that it is actually based on an original that came out. It was shown in 1987, I believe, at Christmas Eve. It's quite hard to get, but it's based on a book by Susan Hill, and it's made into a brilliant stage play, which is on in London. And of course, women in black are quite creepy because they give that sense of foreboding. And I think that some of these things that are being seen, whether it's women in white or black, are not just deceased sort of, spirits of the deceased. I think there's more to it. I think they are sort of harbingers of doom or even maybe something good that's about to happen. So I think women in black are quite common as well, but the one in Rochester is an old hag, and that's quite hideous.
Now, and I've got another question for you in the chat room. Have you found anything at all on your travels?
Of a ghostly sense, or?
Anything at all?
Well, regarding the big cat stuff, yes, I've seen a black leopard 3 times. That was 2 different black cats. One was in 2000, I see it twice, and a different one in 2008. I've seen a lynx. We find lots of leopard scats, lots of sheep and deer that have been killed. We've found dogs that have been eaten. Leopard paw prints. I've got a leopard whisker, which is very, very bizarre. So I'm very similar. I go out sort of into the field a lot, do a lot of research, of course, through archives.
And where that's concerned, you've got a Facebook page, haven't you?
I've got one called Just Big Cats in Kent, or you can go on the internet and I've got Kent Big Cats. I've been doing this for 30 years, the big cat stuff. But in a ghostly sense, I've never really had anything happen to me. I think it's because I don't really kind of work with sort of ghost hunters and people like that, because I think they can influence themselves without realising it. But I've gone into some very strange places, had a few weird experiences with the living, but nothing really with the dead, apart from the occasional sort of creaking door that might open on its own. But nothing really sort of bizarre when it comes to the paranormal.
No. Right. Do you think that some of the strange phenomena that people are witnessing across the globe are related in any way?
Yeah, I think again, which kind of proves it's more to do with us rather than something else. I'm not saying that people don't experience things. You know, when you revert back to Bluebell Hill, people clearly are having experiences on the hill, and not everybody that is seeing these spirits believes in this sort of thing. So that makes it more interesting.
Yeah.
Especially when more than one witness sees something. But I do think we've got archetypes that are embedded in our subconscious and folklore, and that they somehow are triggered by some obscure cosmic mechanism that has very obscure sort of connections. Again, we've always had reports going back hundreds of years of fairies and angels, and I think over the years these things still exist, but we've got different names to them. I think you've only got to look at alien abduction and stuff like that. I think that is very much connected to the human psyche, and it's very much similar to what is called the old hag syndrome and sleep paralysis. Right. So I don't know if there's really other things out there, but I think we are prone to these type of things, and there's some type of tear in the fabric of time where maybe these things, or whatever they are, come through. But then again, the mind is a very powerful thing.
Right. Now, you've mentioned before in various interviews that when it comes to your research, as I advertised you tonight, that you've been hellhound hunting. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, again, that would be just kind of if I get reports of stuff, I like to go out and investigate it. Or if I'm writing articles or stuff for books, I like to try and do proper research. But regarding hellhounds, again, that would be huge phantom black dogs. But people have always spoken about these giant black dogs over the years. But I've got reports of some that are black and white, some that are red and white, some that are purple, yellow. So I think, again, these are meant to be bad omens and stuff like that. But again, maybe it depends on the witness. Maybe we see a certain type of dog or coloration because there's something deep within us that we unintentionally sort of trigger it. But I've had some very sort of weird encounters regarding sort of being shot at and stuff like that. So, but you do in weird places. So.
Tigger's asking whether you've ever heard of the hellhound story from Oldham, which he's been told is supposed to be quite a famous one.
The trouble is, when you look at places, I think I've mentioned in my monster book, that may be mentioned in there, because there are reports around sort of Manchester, but the awkward thing is like, when I talk about Black Shut, got Padfoot, Striker, Guy Trash, these don't seem to have any kind of boundaries, so they can easily cross from town to town, village to village, county to county. But what I find interesting is that some, exactly the same as ghosts, some are said to have no head, some are said to burst into balls of flame.
Yeah.
You've got the beast of Bungay going back to sort of many, many centuries. Some are said to sort of have a strange sulphuric smell. So it's just down to interpretation, I think. And I find it odd nowadays, you don't get many reports of these black dogs. So it's almost as if we outgrow them.
Yeah.
Something else comes along.
Right. And I don't know whether this is an old thing I've read or whether it is your new book. That you've been looking into London about the Highgate vampires and everything, 7 to 8 foot tall entities with red eyes. Do they actually exist?
The Highgate so-called vampire is a bit of a touchy subject because it's something that was alleged to have happened in the 1960s and early 70s involving a very gothic cemetery in North London called Highgate, which is in two sort of parts, the western and the eastern.
Yeah. And
people often claim to have seen a large floating black mass with two sort of points of red light thought to be be its eyes, and it would almost give off like a draining type of aura. The press got hold of the story, like all good newspapers, put two and two together, jumped to about 3,000 and decided it was some type of vampire. And then, like a lot of places, whether it's Cannock Chase or wherever, it attracts lots of weirdos. And then people start seeing things which aren't really there. And then after a while, it kind of fizzles out. But the problem is, of course, with Highgate is that it's an amazing cemetery, but it's very fortified nowadays. It's all under sort of a manageable neglect. But I think what there was experienced was some type of psychic entity to an extent connected maybe to the witnesses, but not a vampire in what we all know and love.
No.
You know, but I think it sounds good calling it the Highgate Vampire. And again, if the story's good enough, then it embeds itself into folklore again.
Yeah, it's not Mothman, is it?
Well, again, interpretation. Some of the reports of Mothman were of a more of an angelic type of creature or something like a man with wings, and he never once ever looked like a moth.
No.
But it sounds good. It sounds like a comic book anti-hero. Mothman, Jersey Devil, Goatman, you know, that type of thing. Spring-Heel Jack. They are things that we create. And we don't seem to realise that we do create these things sometimes.
No. What would you say are zoo forms? What kind of creatures?
Which ones are zoo forms?
Yeah.
Well, again, it's down to interpretation, but when you've got a creature, like I say, like Mothman, this was a thing that was said to have been seen around West Virginia in Point Pleasant, around the Silver Bridge in sort of the 60s. And it was said to be like a winged entity with sort of red eyes. But about 4 to 5 years before that, a similar creature was seen actually in Kent by a group of youths coming home late at night from a party. So some people call them sort of bat-like figures. You've got the Owlman of Mornon, which was in the 70s down in Cornwall in the West Country. People had seen this figure. But it seemed to be mostly teenage girls or people in the company of teenage girls. So I wonder if sometimes, again, it's to do with the psyche. But again, this is how what we would call zoo forms, because they're things that can't zoologically exist.
Yeah.
So they're a mix between hoaxes, misinterpretation, and possible sort of psychic phenomena, I suppose.
Now, we had a good friend of ours, I think it's a mutual friend, Richard Freeman was on last week.
All right, yep, great guy.
Yep, love Richard. Now, he was saying when it comes to the cryptozoology side, there are people out there that looks at the cryptozoologists as madmen and, you know, crazy and God knows what else. But like we've said, that we need that sort of thing in this world. We need these people to go out and find these animals and be interested enough to do so, because like we've always said, back in the day, if nobody had gone out and listened to these tribesmen about these crazy animals that they were going on about, something hideous, we wouldn't have things like gorillas and giant pandas and stuff like that. You know,
probably it's like in all walks of life, whether it's, I don't know, football or your local pub, you're always going to get a few weirdos around and a lot of detractors as well. And you get I get a lot of skeptics who refuse to go out and have a look, but will sit behind the computer and hide behind a false fake name and just slag you off, but they won't sort of look at what you're presenting.
No.
So, you know, I think that they always get tarred with this, cryptozoologists, especially sort of people like Richard Freeman, get tarred with this brush of being kind of wearing a safari jacket and kind of, you know, a huge net and going out kind of chasing shadows. But some of the evidence that Richard has found is amazing, because when a lot of people start reporting something, like I say, with the case of the mountain gorilla, the tribes used to talk about a man that runs out of the forest and bangs his chest, and science used to laugh. And then, of course, it was getting a body which eventually convinced them. The trouble is, like in all walks of life, with this type of thing, you are probably going to need a body to convince people.
Yeah.
And if you do end up with sort of hair, they will probably turn around and say, oh, well, you know, it's an unknown ape or whatever. You know, Richard's gone and looked for the thylacine. He's gone to look for the orang pendek in Sumatra.
Yeah.
Giant snakes. So there's got to be something in some of these. But the trouble is, until we find that great piece of evidence, it's always on the fringe of science or folklore. So then it's always open to ridicule, which is the same, really, because not more money is put into funding and investment for this type of thing.
Now, going back to your Bluebell Hill legends and stuff, we've been advertising since September your ghost walks. How have they been going?
Well, I've been doing them for quite a while now. I used to do I do a ghost walk through Rochester, because Rochester's a lovely place, all the old cobbles, and I do those on the last Sunday of every month. But I used to do the Bluebell Hill one in the day. But people kept ringing me up and saying, "Oh, would you mind taking me and a group of friends along and doing one at night?" And it just got so popular, especially this time of year, with people from sort of between. I normally have groups of anywhere between 5, and then it can go right up to sort of 80 to 90 people. But I prefer smaller groups, and I take them all around these areas and show them all the old mysterious stones, talk about the big cat and a lot of the stories. I don't sort of have any sort of silly gimmicks. It's all based on sort of my research over the years, though. But it's quite a creepy place. It's worth going on.
And I believe that I read on your the Ghost of Bluebell Hill group that people do ask you how many ghosts are actually there, and you say that you've made grown men cry.
Well, people just sometimes think they're a bit braver than what they are. And sometimes they like to come out on my walks or come to my talks, which I do. I do a lot of lectures pretty much every day, and people think, "Oh, this is just going to be a joke." And then when you present the evidence, people get quite shocked. But when you take sort of men down into the woods on a walk, and they're all kind of not taking it seriously, and then something happens, or you tell a certain story, and you see them kind of like their torches start flashing everywhere, and they start seeing things and getting a bit spooked. And then I offer for them, would they like to stay out in the woods, maybe looking for the big cat? And then you soon, find out who the brave people are then. So, but, each to their own, I suppose. Everyone sort of goes on the walks and for their own sort of interpretations, I suppose.
Yeah, next time I'm down, I'm going to have to make sure that you're doing something and pop over and see you.
Yeah, you should. That'd be great, yeah.
Now, connected to Bluebell Hill, there's a place called Kit's Coty, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and am I right in thinking it's an old pagan place?
No one's really sure what it is, but Kit's Coty is a strange Neolithic structure that goes back thousands of years. There's similar sort of constructions dotted all over the UK, but people think it's a burial chamber. Some people think it was a weird type of altar. So, because no one really knows what it's for or how it got there, all of Bluebell Hill is all chalk, so there's no way that these stones would have come from local ground. So they kind of just jut out of the landscape. It's annoying to me that so many people go to Stonehenge, and yet they very rarely visit somewhere like Kit's Coty, which is probably older.
Yeah.
And then further down the hill, you've got another mysterious set of stones called Little Kit's Coty, and it's all very kind of Blair Witch Project style atmosphere, because no one knows why they're there, and these stones are just dotted throughout the woods, all in different sort of formations to one another. So it's quite a creepy place, but I go to all these places on the walk because they're such amazing places that people often can't find, and they don't know enough about them. So.
And how long does the walk last for?
About 2 hours.
Really?
Again, I've done walks up there all day, and we've kind of met and then gone for a walk and sort of had something to eat in a local pub, and then walked another 3-4 hours, because if you're going to, people often ask me about the big cats and stuff like that, but again, you've got to be, I often go out on my own, or just maybe take one friend, because you end up with too many people, then, you always get people making a noise and stuff like that, and people have only got a smell wrong, with the wrong perfume or aftershave. Yeah. So you've got to kind of, be a bit more inquisitive when it comes to a cat, but generally with the actual walks, I do them at night because the atmosphere is better.
You seem very enthusiastic about all this. What drives you, Neil?
The fact that I've always been sick to death of repetition in books. I think the trouble is nowadays there's so many of these haunted books coming out, and too many people, I suppose, are being given book contracts nowadays. Of course, the big thing nowadays is self-publishing, which is great because it means that people can write about subjects that maybe big publishers don't touch. But it also means that anybody can write a book. And I think, again, when I was a kid, I used to read a lot of books and think, well, this is incorrect. And I wanted to write stuff about local information that nobody else knew about. If there was a plague pit in a certain area, or if there was a hanging in a certain area. So I just always try to write stuff that's a bit different. Yeah.
So, and finally, what advice would you give to someone just coming into this field of study?
Regarding the supernatural, I think there's a lot of ghost hunters around, and I think sort of the stuff like Most Haunted, which I'm not a fan of, but that kind of got a lot more people interested. It's very much entertainment with the ghost. Yeah. That's what people seem to forget, and nowadays we have all these reports of orbs and stuff like that, but I think it's good for people to get into, if you're into a bit of mystery and stuff like that, and it is. People have got to remember it is about entertainment. sometimes it can get a bit sinister, but with the big cat stuff, it's great because I love to show people about nature as well, because I know loads of people that have never even seen a fox or a deer or a badger. So it's nice to show them around the local woods and what signs to look for. But it's just, it's something that should drive everybody. We all need a bit of mystery in our lives. I think that's the main thing.
Yeah.
Nice to write about it as well and just show people this sort of stuff. But it's also nice to write stuff that no one else has heard about. And people say, oh, that's really interesting. We didn't know that. We've always heard the same old story. So it's nice to shed new light on old stuff.
So apart from the Kent Big Cat, blogspot.co.uk, which I've just put on here for everybody, what other websites can they find you on?
Well, so I'm not a big fan of Facebook, but I've got a Big Cat in Kent page on there, which I update, because I did a few books a few years ago called Mystery Animals of the British Isles, London, and Mystery Animals of the British Isles, Kent, but I'm planning another one with some extra photographs, a bit more concise. I have got another one called www.beastsoflondon.blogspot.com.
Okay.
I've got a few of those, but generally, like I say, there's a lot of stuff I don't put on the internet. I used to have a blog for my zoo form stuff as well, but I don't really update that as much. But all my books are available on Amazon and stuff like that. See, so and the monster one is I think it's about 400 pages, and so they're quite big. Whereas the haunted ones I've done and the Kent Urban Legends are only about sort of 100 or so pages. They're little informative guidebooks.
Right, okay. Well, I'll definitely be booking that one for Haunted Kent, and probably going for the Rochester and Chatham as well, seeing as it's my old stomping ground.
Well, that's right. Again, Chatham's kind of got so much history with the dockyard and places like that. So, and I spent 30 years growing up there, and I moved to Rochester about 6-7 years ago, and again was amazed at the lack of interest in the local ghost stories, and it's stuff that happens all the time. It's just nice to write about local areas. Yeah,
well, this is it, So what's next for Neil Arnold? What you're planning?
Well, I'm going to start possibly doing a bit of self-publishing myself. I'd like to do a follow-up to my monster book, because that was always quite popular. That did well in America, that one. It's like an A to Z. It's good for kids. Again, I'm doing the walks and talks. The talks is what I basically do for a living anyway, and I'm hoping to do another Big Cat book at some point, but I'm also writing about sort of stuff like music and that as well. So there's lots of other things that take up my time. It's not all about just kind of sitting in the woods all the time, really. You do need a bit of a break from weird stuff sometimes, especially when you've met some of the strange people I have. So.
This is And are you planning anything down at the Weird Weekend next year?
No, as far as I'm aware, I don't know. The main talk I do, I don't really sort of... I did one Weird Weekend probably 6-7 years ago. Yeah. Had a bit of it was a brilliant experience for the actual talk and meeting all the friends, but I did have a bit of a weird thing happen. So since then I've kind of like backed off of it from a bit and done. Right. I'm not very good with kind of travelling. Yeah. That well, but I did have something very bizarre happen to the point of it made me question quite a few things. So I've just kind of laid off from that a bit. So I've got no plans at the moment of going too far afield when I'm sort of doing okay where I am at the moment. So. Well, I'm hoping to get back down to Chatham end of January sometime. And just let me know. If not, I can always just show you around sort of Bluebell Hill and places like that anyway. But like I say, the Kent Urban Legends book has got a lot in it that people all over the UK would even... Yeah. It's not just based on Kent. There's legends in there that people think, well, I know that happened to a friend of mine, and you'll realise that it didn't really happen. Yeah. That's why I've done it, just to let people know it goes on all the time. Well, this is it. Well, that's great. It's been a lovely chatting to you at last. I've been trying to get you on the show for ages. Thanks for having me on. There's so many stories to sort of tell people. In the end, you just kind of end up rambling on, and you could end up there all night. So. You ramble away, Neil. And we'd love to get you back on the show again, if that's okay. Yeah, no worries. Sometime in the new year. No worries. Steve just wants to ask a question.
Yeah, can I just ask, out of all the books that you've written, which would you recommend?
Say all of them.
Well, it depends what area you're interested in. The monster one was my first ever book, and for a first book, it's got a brilliant cover. And because it's an A to Z of just monsters. It's monsters that nobody else has ever heard of. Some are completely bizarre. But then again, if you want something more comprehensive, then the Mystery Animals of the British Isles, London, goes all into the Highgate vampire stuff. It talks about lots of weird London stuff. But then again, the Kent Urban Legends one is quite good fun. But then I've done one called Shadows in the Sky, the Haunted Airways of Britain, which is sort of like phantom planes and weird lights. And I did one called Shadows on the Sea.
Yeah.
The Maritime Mysteries of Britain, which is good for sort of ghost hunters and cryptozoologists because it's got sea serpents in it, mermaids and ghost boats and stuff like that. So I'm trying to keep stuff pretty varied so it will interest a variety of people really.
Yeah,
Done by all of them basically.
There's quite a few books you've done, as I say, Paranormal London, Haunted Chatham, Rochester, Tunbridge Wells, the Haunted Airways of Britain. That would be really interesting because obviously we've got the one not far down the road from here about the phantom Lancaster bomber. That's
right. Again, they make good stories. I just don't know if there's much in them. I think over time they become classic stories, and nobody really. I live near a place called not far from Biggin Hill, and there's been reports there of a phantom Spitfire and ghostly airmen, but the reports seem very, very